April 30, 1975. Capitalist class rule smashed in Vietnam. For Southeast Asian Trotskyism. Adapted from Workers Vanguard, number 68, May 1975. On April 30, 1975, the Armed Forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam (DRV) and the National Liberation Front (NLF) rode triumphantly into Saigon, as leaders of the defeated puppet regime and the South Vietnamese bourgeoisie fled the country by every available means. The military victory of the DRV and NLF marks the end of 30 years of civil war against colonialism and imperialism and their local allies. It means the overthrow of capitalist rule in South Vietnam, a historic conquest for the working people of the entire world and one which must be unconditionally defended by class-conscious workers against imperialist attack. We hail this stunning defeat of U.S. imperialism, the first in a major war during the 20th century, and greet the victory of our class brothers and sisters in Indochina with internationalist proletarian solidarity. The struggle against the imperialists' Vietnam War has also been a major task of socialists in the imperialist centers, dominating the political experience of a whole generation of young aspiring revolutionaries. And it is as fellow combatants in the international class struggle that we warn the Indochinese masses that they must place no confidence in their Stalinist leaders. The victory in Vietnam belongs to the heroic worker and peasant fighters in Indochina, who have struggled resourcefully and tenaciously for decades, in order to break the grip of imperialist domination and capitalist exploitation on the peninsula. But while a victorious social revolution has occurred, the struggle to establish revolutionary and internationalist workers' states in the region is far from over. In Vietnam, both North and South political power is not in the hands of the working masses, expressed by democratic rule through Soviet's workers' councils as was achieved by the Russian Revolution of 1917. Nor is there in Indochina today a Bolshevik party, which could lead the revolutionary struggle forward, by extending it internationally in the centers of world capitalism. The new Stalinist rulers in Saigon are as committed to the treacherous policy of peaceful coexistence with imperialism, as those in Moscow until the 1991-1992 capitalist counter-revolution and today in Beijing, Hanoi and Havana. Instead, what has been created in South Vietnam is a deformed workers' state, qualitatively equivalent to the degenerated workers' state, which emerged in Russia with the consolidation of the Stalin-led bureaucracy. The ruling bureaucracies of the deformed workers' states are narrowly nationalist in outlook, attempting to balance precariously between imperialism and the working class. Based on the property forms of the workers' state, they occasionally put up a limited and distorted defense of the social conquests achieved by the overthrow of capitalism, in order to preserve their own privileged position. But because their rule is based on the political expropriation of the working class, these petty bourgeois bureaucratic castes are incapable of mobilizing the proletarian masses for an international revolutionary assault on the bastions of world capitalism, since it would simultaneously mean their own demise. The Stalinist rulers in Hanoi and Saigon must be overthrown by a workers' political revolution led by a Trotskyist party, in order to establish the organs of proletarian democracy, and open the road to socialism. At the same time, the Vietnamese workers' state must be defended against imperialism. All Indochina, all Southeast Asia must go communist. Military victory and social revolution. The cost of these momentous victories in terms of human suffering by the toilers of Vietnam has been tremendous. The barbarous policies of the cynical mass murderers of U.S. imperialism and French colonialism, the free fire zones subjected to saturation bombing by B-52s, the so-called pacification programs consisting of assassination of all political opponents of the puppet regimes, the so-called strategic hamlets, which sought to eliminate the insurgents' popular support by locking up peasants in concentration camps, have produced millions of dead and maimed. But still the Indochinese workers and peasants fought on, driven by a burning desire not only to be rid of the pimps and butchers in Saigon, but also to remove the daily oppression inexorably caused by capitalist exploitation. At a tremendous disadvantage in terms of firepower and sophisticated weaponry, the result of the refusal of the USSR and China to deliver adequate military supplies, they were able to militarily defeat the cream of the French army, the largest U.S. expeditionary forces since World War II, over 500,000 American military personnel in Vietnam at one point, and the most mechanized army in Asia. However, the program of the bureaucracies in Hanoi, Beijing and Moscow who led, controlled and supplied the insurgents was not to carry out a social revolution through defeating the bourgeoisie. Justifying their appetites for class collaboration by the Stalinist Menshevik schema of two-stage revolution, they sought to achieve democratic, i.e., bourgeois governments of national reconciliation of all classes save the imperialists and their most direct flunkies. This was expressed in programs such as those of the South Vietnamese NLF, which called for Popular Front coalition government with the bourgeoisie, omitting demands for agrarian revolution, and guaranteeing the right of capitalists to continue to exploit their wage slaves, and in repeated sellouts at the bargaining table, especially in 1945 and 1954. But while the Stalinist leaders remained committed to a strategy of betrayal and class collaboration, they were also confronted with fundamental historical and social realities. The extreme weakness of the Vietnamese bourgeoisie, which prevented it from rebelling against French colonial and U.S. imperialist domination, made that coterie of drug traffickers, rice merchants, rack-running landlords, corrupt military mercenaries, textile sweatshop bosses, rubber plantation managers and Honda salesmen doubly afraid of any mobilization of the exploited masses. Although the NLF continued to call for the formation of coalition governments until scant hours before they marched into Saigon, the fabled anti-imperialist bourgeoisie never materialized. To the lasting benefit of the Indochinese laboring masses, the so-called Paris Peace Accords were never implemented. Though the DRV and NLF military forces fought well, and defeated the puppet troops in the only two real battles of the last 6 weeks, the fall of Saigon came not as a result of a successful insurgent offensive, properly speaking, but because of the complete collapse of the two regime and army. A single defeat in the Central Highlands produced a panicked retreat that put the DRV and NLF forces within 50 miles of the capital in 2 weeks, practically without firing a shot. The scenes of this jumbled collapse dominated the news from Vietnam during the last days of the puppet government. The wild looting and chaotic terror unleashed in Da Nang by drunken bands of the Arvin soldiers was succeeded by the desperate clawing of Saigon merchants and collaborators to get into the U.S. Embassy and join the select circle of those who would get a ticket to America from President Ford. While two sent off a final shipment of $16 million in gold bullion to Switzerland, well-connected prostitutes and wives of military officers began arriving in Guam by the plane load. The predominance of Air Force families among the early passengers were explained by a threat from Saigon fighter pilots to shoot down the C-130s, if their relatives were not included. 45 years of struggle against imperialism. The struggle of the Indochinese masses against colonial oppression and the yoke of capitalist exploitation goes back well past the end of World War II. The Indochinese Communist Party, the ICP, was formed in 1930, and led an important peasant revolt in central Vietnam during the same year. During the late 1930s, however, the Stalinist ICP faced considerable competition from two Trotskyist groups, particularly in southern Vietnam. One, the International Communist League, the ICL, led by Ho Hu Tung, was founded in 1931, while the second, larger, group was in a common front with the Southern Stalinists from 1933 to 1937. As the ICP was obliged by Kremlin dictates and its program of class collaboration to give support to French colonialism during the period of the Popular Front government in France, the Trotskyists were able to greatly expand their influence. In 1939 those groups swamped the Stalinists in colonial elections, winning 80% of the votes, as the masses decisively rejected Ho Chi Minh's support to so-called progressive colonialism. In August 1945 the Stalinists, now known as the Viet Minh, moved together with bourgeois nationalists to take over the French-Japanese colonial apparatus, as the Japanese surrender was announced. However, when British troops entered Saigon they were greeted by the Viet Minh, in line with Stalin's policy of alliance with the Western so-called democratic imperialists during World War II. In contrast, the Trotskyist ICL called for opposition to the imperialists, agrarian revolution, expropriation of the bourgeoisie and a workers' and peasants' government. The ICL's call did not remain simply on paper, but found a mass response, as scores of people's committees were formed in the Saigon area, the dominant influence in them being that of the Trotskyists. Although the Stalinist police succeeded in arresting and shooting most of the leaders, a working-class uprising broke out a few days later in response to the British-French moves to take power from the Popular Front government. While the Viet Minh negotiated, to no avail, the Trotskyist-led resistance went down fighting. The Trotskyists had also been active in the north, but there the domination of the Viet Minh was unchallenged. As Ho was preparing to sign an agreement permitting the reintroduction of French troops in early 1946, the witch hunt began against Trotskyists intensified. Tattersay Thou was murdered on orders from the Stalinist leader at that time, as were virtually all remaining Trotskyist cadres. Thus, if since 1946 the Stalinist leaders have been dominant in Vietnam, it is not because of a revolutionary line but rather because of the efficiency of their assassination squads. After the reintroduction of colonial troops with the assent of Ho Chi Minh, the Stalinists were forced to abandon the cities and retreat into guerrilla warfare. However, by 1954 they had been able to inflict a military defeat on the French army, not only in the north but throughout Indochina. While Russian and Chinese pressure was instrumental in inducing the Viet Minh negotiators at the 17th parallel as well as Laos and Cambodia, decisive victory was within reach. Thus Ho's agreement to the Geneva deal was another sharp blow against the struggle of the Indochinese masses. With a change in the imperialist paymasters from Paris to more affluent Washington, the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem was able to partially stabilize South Vietnam for a couple of years through the use of ruthless terror. Peasants were driven off their land, suspected communists were tried by special tribunals and murdered by the hundreds. Sporadic resistance sprang up, often led by underground former Viet Minh cadre who had stayed behind. But not until 1960 when the National Liberation Front was formed did Hanoi give any appreciable aid to the southern rebels. Ho's concern was above all to scrupulously respect the terms of the Geneva sellout, vainly hoping that the Butcher Diem would allow so-called free elections. The subsequent intervention of large numbers of the United States troops represented a major setback for the NLF and DRV. But with the massacre of several 100,000 workers and peasants in Indonesia in 1965, accomplishing an important objective of imperialism in the area, and given the absence of any prospect of victory for the Saigon regime, and active hostility of U.S. intervention among large sections of American youth and increasingly in the working class, the basis was laid for the development for widespread bourgeois defeatism. This was not confined to peace demonstrations or left liberals like Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern, but because the dominant position of decisive sections of the American capitalist ruling class. As economic problems multiplied and the United States' inability to continue playing the role of hegemonic world policeman became clearer, the Nixon regime moved toward negotiations finally resulting in the so-called Paris Peace Accords of 1973. These accords did not lead to peace in Vietnam, and represented the extortion of concessions by the imperialists in return for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. While declaring no support to the robbers' peace, the Spartacist League also recognized an important difference from the 1954 sellout, the ceasefire in place, that is, the continued presence of large numbers of DRV and NLF troops in the South. We judged that the ceasefire could well lead to a Viet Cong victory in the South, but pointed out that this was a gamble, and did not represent a change in the Stalinist strategy of betrayal. When the NLF victory finally came, 2 years later, it was because of the military collapse of the puppet regime. Finding no substantial force with which to make a coalition government, the Stalinists finally were forced to take Saigon on their own. Toward a communist Indochina, for a Soviet Federation of Southeast Asia. The victory of the Vietnamese Stalinists and the overthrow of capitalist rule occurred under exceptional circumstances, extreme disorganization of the native bourgeoisie, economic and political difficulties of the imperialists, which have prevented renewed U.S. military intervention, and above all, of the absence of the working class organized to fight in its own interests. The regime, which they established does not, and cannot, base itself on organs of proletarian democracy, but rather on the fiat of a Bonapartist bureaucracy. The tasks of Marxists in Indochina today is take forward the revolutionary struggle, by fighting for a workers' political revolution to overthrow the bureaucracy, demanding the creation of democratic workers' councils, as the basis for the new state apparatus, and freedom for all parties, which defend the revolution against counter-revolutionary attack. Above all, for the struggle to go forward, final victory requires the extension of proletarian revolution throughout Indochina, Southeast Asia and the imperialist centers. All Indochina must go communist. For Southeast Asian Trotskyism, for the rebirth of the Fourth International.